Hey everyone! So today we're going to talk about the southern Indian state of Kerala, a place that's pretty famous for its incredible social development. But here's the thing. This story isn't about some grand government plan. Nope. This is about a revolution that came from the inside out. All right, let's get into it. So, you have to ask, right? How did this one state in India end up with some of the highest literacy rates and best social indicators, not just in the country, but in the world? You know, it's a question that has really fascinated people for decades. And the answer? Well, it's not simple, but it is incredibly powerful. And here's the absolute key to the whole thing. Long before there were any big government programs, there were grassroots movements. We're talking about communities looking in the mirror, seeing their own oppressive customs, and organizing themselves to tear them down. This internal awakening is the secret sauce of the Kerala model. And the very first domino to fall? The one thing that kicked everything else off, it was education. The reformers of the time saw it as more than just learning to read and write. For them, it was the ultimate tool for liberation. The first real spark was lit way back in the 19th century, thanks to Christian missionaries. Now, they brought in an idea that was, well, pretty revolutionary back then: education for everyone. They started opening schools for girls and for lower caste children who had always been shut out. They literally broke the first and most important barrier. And you had pioneers like Dr. Herman Gundert who even created the essential tools for learning, like the first proper Malayalam dictionaries. But what's really fascinating is how this idea became a system. A man named Saint Chavara Kuriakose Elias, who people now call the father of Kerala literacy, came up with a simple but absolutely game-changing order. He said that every single church had to have a school attached to it, a Pallikodam, and if it didn't, it would be shut down. Just like that, with one rule: education was woven into the very fabric of the community. Okay, so with the seeds of education now planted, you start to see these powerful reform movements just explode within Kerala's different communities. And each one was tackling its own very specific, very difficult challenges. So let's start with the Nayars. Now, even though they were an upper caste community, they were stuck. They were being dragged down by traditions that were basically ruining them, financially and socially. Think ridiculously expensive rituals that were bankrupting families, and a really complicated matrilineal inheritance system that was causing all sorts of instability. And right into the middle of this crisis steps a man named Manathu Padmanabhavan. He starts the Nayars Service Society, the NSS, back in 1914, with one clear goal: modernize the community. And his strategy was just brilliant. To get money for schools, he started something called Pidioro. He just asked every Nayar woman to put aside a single handful of rice every time she cooked. That's it. But all those small handfuls, when collected, were enough to build an entire educational network. And you know what? It worked. All that organizing and pressure paid off in a huge way. The NSS lobbied and pushed until they got the Nayar Regulation Act of 1925 passed. This law officially got rid of the old matrilineal system and completely restructured the Nayar family, setting them up for a much more modern and stable future. But this whole pattern of communities reforming themselves wasn't just happening with the Nayars. Take a look at the Namboothiri Brahmins. I mean, here the situation was, if anything, even more desperate. Especially for women. They lived in such extreme seclusion that it was literally called the hell within the Elam. And at the same time, this rule that only the oldest son could marry a Namboothiri woman left thousands of younger men and women just trapped with no future. The man who rose up to challenge all this was V.T. Bhattathiripad. And get this, the slogan for his organization was just stunningly bold. It was, "Make the Namboothiri a human being." And his weapon of choice? It wasn't a protest march, it was a play. His play, From the Kitchen to the Stage, was like a literary bombshell that exposed all the pain hidden inside the community. But VT didn't just write. He took action. He took his play and had it performed inside the very homes it was criticizing. He led a begging march all the way across the state just to raise money to educate poor Namboothiri kids. Then, in this incredible act of defiance, he publicly cut off his sacred Brahminical thread. And maybe most shocking of all, he organized the community's first ever remarriage for a widow, shattering a taboo that was centuries old. And this wave of change was happening everywhere. You had Vaikom Abdul Qadir Molavi, who fought for modern education for Muslims, using journalism as his main weapon. He actually owned a newspaper and gave his editor total freedom to criticize the king, which was unheard of. And then there's the incredible story of Poikail Yohanan. He was born into slavery and converted to Christianity,
only to find that the same old caste discrimination followed him right into the church. So he just started his own movement, famously burning a Bible and declaring that the story of his people wasn't in its pages.
So for decades, you have all these movements working on social and cultural change. But then, in the 1950s, everything changes. A single flashpoint event turns these social organizations into massive political forces, and the entire landscape of Kerala is transformed forever.
Here's what happened. In 1957, Kerala's newly elected communist government brings in two really controversial bills. The first was an education bill that wanted to regulate all the private schools, many of which were run by powerful groups like the Catholic Church and the NSS. The second was an agrarian relations bill that wanted to give land to tenant farmers, which, as you can imagine, really worried the big landowning communities. All of a sudden, these powerful community groups felt like they were under direct attack. So what started as just being against a couple of new laws blew up into something much, much bigger. And this quote from the NSS leader, Manathu Padmanabhan, just says it all. The goal wasn't just to change the bills anymore. The goal was to remove the government. It was a flat-out declaration of political war.
This whole event, which became known as the liberation struggle, was a massive turning point. It was the moment everyone realized that these organizations, built over decades for social reform, could now be turned into powerful political weapons, powerful enough to take on and even bring down an elected government. Social power had officially become political power.
So after all of this history, what do you end up with? Well, all of these different threads, the push for education, the community reforms, the political battles, they all weave together to create the modern state of Kerala we know today. I mean, the legacy is pretty clear, right? That early obsession with education, it created one of the most literate populations in the entire country. All that community organizing, it led to a population that is incredibly politically aware and engaged. And that fight against injustice from within, it gave women and lower caste groups a huge head start on empowerment, which really built the foundation for all the other amazing achievements in healthcare and development that came later.
So I think the big takeaway here is that the famous Kerala model wasn't something designed in an office by some expert. It was forged in the fire of these grassroots social movements. And that really leads us to the final question, doesn't it? 100 years later, how does this incredibly powerful, deeply rooted legacy of community politics continue to shape everything that happens in the state of Kerala today? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for watching.